Mr. Men, Little Miss, Mr. Bump goes bumpity bump. Roger Hargreaves. Read along with these words: Mr. Bump, mountain, Little Miss Helpful, skis, Mr. Grumpy, lake, fish, bear, rocks, carrot, snowman, snowball, tree, Little Miss Whoops, snowplow. One snowy dilly-tailed day, Mr. Bump rode up a mountain with Little Miss Helpful. Little Miss Helpful was going to teach Mr. Bump how to ski. "You will like this, Mr. Bump," said Little Miss Helpful. "It is so simple."
"It's the simple things that I find most dangerous,"
Mr. Bump said. Crunch! Mr. Bump fell off the chair. "Don't forget to ski away from the chair," said Little Miss Helpful.
"Now you tell me,"
said Mr. Bump. "Okay, Mr. Bump," said Little Miss Helpful. "Let's see what you can do." Mr. Bump stood up on his skis, but as he moved, Mr. Bump's skis began to slip. Swoosh! Mr. Bump slid down the mountain. Down and down he went, until Mr. Bump and his skis finally went right over the cliff. Splat! Mr. Bump landed next to Mr. Grumpy. Mr. Grumpy was fishing in a chilly lake. "Well, don't just stand there, Mr. Bump," Mr. Grumpy said. "Help me catch some fish." Just then a fish jumped up and hit Mr. Bump in the face. Thwap! "Crooked cucumbers," said Mr. Grumpy. "Stop splashing, Mr. Bump. You'll scare away the fish." Mr. Bump grabbed a fish. He held on tightly. Splash! The fish pulled Mr. Bump under water. The fish swam through a hole, but Mr. Bump got stuck. The fish finally pulled Mr. Bump through the hole. Then it pulled him out of the water. It pulled him right past Mr. Grumpy and a hungry bear. "Wait for me, Mr. Bump," Mr. Grumpy said, as Mr. Bump zoomed past him. Mr. Grumpy grabbed onto Mr. Bump, and the fish pulled them both across the water. Mr. Bump let go of the fish and climbed ashore. In a pile of snow, Mr. Bump saw some rocks and a carrot. He decided to build a snowman. Mr. Bump began to roll some snow up a hill.
The bigger the snowball, the bigger the snowman,
Mr. Bump told himself. Soon the snowball was even bigger than Mr. Bump. Mr. Bump's snowball was too big. Whoosh! It rolled right over the edge, and Mr. Bump rolled with it. Down the hill they went, and crashed into a tree. Just then little Miss Whoops came by in her snowplough. "Hi there, Mr. Bump," she said. "What are you doing lying in the snow?" But before Mr. Bump could answer, little Miss Whoops's snowplough scooped him right up. "Whoops!" said little Miss Whoops.
"Poopity poop!"
said Mr. Bump.
"I should have stayed home today."
Thank you for listening.